Hello, everybody. Happy Father's Day to any fathers out there. This is Thinking Without the Box, our second edition. We did Frege's Sense and Reference maybe a month ago, and this seemed like a good extension of going along the lines of meaning and looking at Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism. But I'm joined today by Gary Edwards, Helena Handbasket, Hypatia of Alexandria, Jack Angstreich. I didn't check with you to see if that's how you say that, but
That's
John,
fine.
John F. McDropout Maximus has joined us. T.J. Downing and myself, Xbox, and Alex Malpass may join us later. And before we get into the topic, I wanted to first do a quick little presentation of the Two Dogmas itself, just to kind of get anyone who's not familiar with it up to speed on kind of what it is we're talking about today. So I've got a little slide presentation here. So Quine's Two Dogmas. Willard Van Orman Quine was an American philosopher of the 20th century, published Two Dogmas of Empiricism in 1951. This countered his mentor, Rudolf Carnap, who he studied under, I think, in Prague in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, who was a part of the logical positivism movement and the Vienna Circle. And Two Dogmas is kind of considered the nail in the coffin of logical positivism. The logical positivism was a 20th century movement, again advocated by the Vienna and Berlin circles. It dealt with verificationism, which involves a theory of knowledge where statements are verifiable by deductive logic or direct observation. Could be where only statements verifiable by deductive logic or direct observation could be objectively true. Quine wrote Two Dogmas to challenge the notion of analyticity. He questions the sameness of meaning, that things are true by definition, and that explores that analyticity can't be justified by non-circular means, and through that synonymy, where one wants to appeal to synonymy, it assumes analyticity, if I understood it correctly. And then has a second dogma involving reductionism, where a meaningful statement is equivalent to some logical construct upon terms which refer to immediate experience. He says that this is taken as a metaphysical article of faith, and that it has yet to be shown. Kind of the conclusions of the work, and everybody is free to correct me after we get through this a little bit. I'm sure that'll no doubt happen, but he doesn't doubt semantics, but the truth by virtue of meaning. That one of the conclusions is that all scientific statements are interconnected, that no proposition is verified in isolation, that concepts are theory-laden and the whole system is being tested, that metaphysics and science overlap, and we ought to believe those things which expedite our dealings with sense experiences. And this rang to me of some form of pragmatism, but we can get into whether he actually intended all of that. Oh, I didn't present it, did I? Wait, did you guys see that? Oh, you did?
Yeah, you can still see it.
Okay, all right, phew. I thought it said present to everyone, and I was worried that I didn't present that. Sorry. So
it's okay because you were the only one talking. So
yes, yeah. I guess that would white box me. So sorry. Got a piece of spinach in my teeth. My daughter cooked me Father's Day breakfast. So anyway, in terms of the context, that's kind of what we're talking about. And I'd asked before we started the hang if Gary Edwards would kind of give us kind of the historical context that Two Dogmas sit in before we get into the actual text.
I'm sorry. Can I just say something really quickly?
Sure.
I just think, like, for the sake of the broader audience, I know you sort of went through some of the stage setting, but maybe it would be helpful if we first, like, you talked about analyticity, but it might be helpful if we talked about what analyticity versus synthetic statements were, just to be sure that, you know, everybody's on track as to what exactly Quine is attacking in that, when he's attacking the, quote, analytic-synthetic distinction. What is the analytic-synthetic distinction?
Sure. Do we want to do that as part of our discussion of the logical positivism of the time? And
well, you can do, because it was that distinction was a big part of the logical positivist program. These two dogmas that Quine was addressing were dogmas that were sort of ideas that he saw as being uncriticized in the logical positivist tradition. Even though he immediately, upon graduating from college, he won a scholarship, a travelling scholarship, with his new wife to go to Vienna and study with Carnap. And there was a lot of discussion. That was the sort of the height of the logical positivism. There was a lot of discussion in that clique of people as to how strong their program was, and Popper was there at the same time as well. And I think what one finds is that as one moves into the 50s, obviously due to the interruption of the war as well, so those sort of objections gained a voice, and amongst them was Quine's criticism of the analytic synthetic distinction. So an analytic truth is a truth that is it is based on well, this is the issue. There's three very tightly bound ideas that seem to revolve around the idea of analyticity, of being an analytic truth. There's meaning, necessity, and synonymity, and being synonyms. And it was taken that there are certain truths that are based on the analysis of concepts. Yeah, they don't rest on any facts about the world. Bachelors are unmarried men. Yeah, you don't have to examine bachelors in order to sort of like discern the truth of that statement. It's in the concept itself. It's a part of the concept itself. You can cash it out in some terms, in terms of the truth conditions of what it is to be a bachelor and what it is to be an unmarried man. There doesn't seem to be any condition where one is true and the other is false, apparently. And what the first, I think it's the first 4 books, there's 6 books altogether in the Two Dogmas. The first 4 address that dogma, if you like, the dogma of there being a distinction, a proper distinction between the analytic and the synthetic, that these are 2 entirely different types of thing. And then, not entirely unrelated to that, there's the second dogma, which is the dogma that, or the uncriticized, the uncritiqued idea that it's individual statements that stand before the jury of evidence, and that these statements make direct reference to they make reference to direct experience. You're perceiving this thing as read. You're hearing this tone. You know, they make that kind. And those are the 2 ideas that he said. Well, no, this is a little bit more confused. The issue is a little bit more complicated than this. Because when we look at these ideas of necessity, analyticity, and synonymity, yeah, we find they sort of they interdepend in a rather circular way. So it isn't entirely clear that what we're calling analytic truths are properly distinct from synthetic truths. Synthetic truths might come along and force us to reassess and to reconstruct what we previously conceived as analytic truths. Now, clearly, that has a number of implications. It's logical positivism itself is based on that distinction being proper, but also it's people often, to this day, often like to think that, for example, metaphysics is a sort of foundational Cartesian prior science or prior study, that it's the foundational root, and that what we have to do first is we have to logically analyze concepts and discern what exists and what can and cannot exist in terms of what can be analyzed out from the conceptual meanings before we move on to the empirical scientific investigation. This course challenges that, because it's say, well, no, that might not be the case, because the science, we might actually be able to start with the science and revise our concepts in the light of our empirical synthetic findings. So it leads to a new chapter in empiricism and in naturalism, which people ignore at their peril, because it's very easy to conflate naturalism and positivism, then knock down positivism and claim victory over naturalism or empiricism. Quine's texts and others like Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind by Wilfrid Sellers and Quine's later texts make that much more difficult. It makes it look like a deception to do that, to knock down naturalism and empiricism by knocking down positivism, because it launches a new post-positivist wave of empiricism and naturalism. The people like Davidson and Lewis and people like that come along, and that's led to where we are today. And I think that's a good context to see Quine's work in.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Could I bring something up, especially as it pertains to the two dogmas? It also kind of relates to Quine's view of the intersection between philosophy and science. He didn't really think that there was any good grounds for a distinction there. So, and he later reveals a good example of this in the Dogmas itself. Something which can be very based, not just metaphysics, but logic itself, especially the grounds of classical logic, like the law of the excluded middle. Something is either true or false. He actually takes an example of possibly quantum mechanics, superposition, wherein that might actually lead us to revise the way we even think of logic itself in light of science. It's, the light of knowledge, the quest of knowledge itself leading us in one area to reassess, in our grand web of things, something completely on the other side of the area. So in light, it's really an interesting example of where if we take, our ways of knowing, our sciences, if you will, in the classical sense of the term, anything that leads us to true knowledge, then for Quine, this could actually provide us a way where we could actually look in disciplines of correcting and leading us to be more interested in other fields, especially as it pertains to revising and working together as experts in any which place in academia.
Sure, there's not a specialist subject that only philosophers, conceptual analysts can work in. He broadens it out to be much more interdisciplinary.
So did we want to first break into analyticity and talk about some of the things there?
I think yes.
Well,
and maybe talk about the two...
oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just wanted to say just a couple of things to follow up on what Gary was saying, just for context setting. So like you had talked about some of the players, like Carnap, Quine. I mean, I guess you would have, and you mentioned, I don't know if you mentioned like Hempel or Neurath or other positivists at the time, but by the time that Quine had published Two Dogmas, I don't know, was that 51, 52?
51 in the journal and 53 in the book, full of other essays, yeah.
Right, but by the time that was happening, I think it's not entirely mistaken to say that the logical positivist movement itself was just sort of slowing down in general, and many of the logical positivists themselves went on to become some of their own critics, like Neurath in particular. I think he was the one that convinced Carnap that you didn't have to be a phenomenalist in the way you thought about the relationship between sense experience and cognitive content and whatnot, and he adopted a physicalistic picture later on, but that itself paved the way for Quine's attack in the second dogma, reductionism. This idea you can reduce all of those reports down to brute reports of sense experience, just individual reports of sense experience.
Mm-hmm.
Hempel attacked the verification criterion of meaning throughout. I think he published, I don't know if it was a paper or a book in the 50s, but even before then he was on the tail end of moving away from what people considered the positivism at the time. And Quine himself had published an attack on this idea of, because one thing what the positivists wanted to do with their analytic synthetic distinction, and this goes all the way really back to Hume's fork, right, where Hume basically made a similar distinction between truths that were true in virtue of, say, meaning alone, or concepts alone, or whatever, and truths that. And the thing about those kinds of truths, those sorts of truths were, in a sense, silent about the world. They didn't affect the world one way or the other. The only kinds of truths that could touch the world were synthetic statements, statements that were not true in virtue of meaning alone. And those were to be subject to the tribunal of experience to acquire content and meaning and value, in some sense. So the logical positivists are sort of picking up on Hume's heritage to some extent there. And what Quine published in the 30s, there was a paper, I think Truth by Convention or something. So even all the way back then, he was attacking this sort of idea of using the analytic the way the logical positivists wanted to explain the a priori or the necessary, right? And like you were pointing out, Gary, like Quine argues both here and in later books or later papers that there's this sort of circle between analyticity, necessity, and the a priori. So this whole project that the logical positivists wanted to do to explain, say, logical truths and mathematical truths in terms of just meaning or convention was doomed to fail. So all I'm just saying is that I think in the outline, Bert, you had said something how this paper was the death knell of logical positivism. I think more properly understood, this is just sort of, by the time we get to this paper,
Right.
logical positivism itself had been like deteriorating significantly.
I think the determining factor was people were prepared to break cover. Previously, they might have been a bit reluctant. It was certainly a subject. These were certainly subjects of discussion amongst positivists going back to the early 30s. But by the 50s, people were prepared to break cover and actually publish in English their dissenting views from the times had changed. Things had moved on.
Yeah, the term I used was nail in the coffin because it was very much dead well before that. And it would be interesting to talk even maybe after we get through the book, also talking about like you mentioned about other works. Something I read recently was Kuhn's book, the structure of scientific revolutions. Thank you.
Right.
I read it just recently.
Oh, okay.
No, actually, I've read it a couple times in the last 2 years, and it was very much in that it seemed like there was a lot of that conversation going on.
Yeah, because this is where people like Quine's dissent led to this. In his later book, his 61 Word and Object, he introduced the idea of an indeterminacy of translation. And this led up to and of course he's talking about holism, he's talking about you judge things in the context of theories rather than particular assertions. So you can see how that led up to things like a structure of scientific revolutions and that kind of, there's paradigm shifts and it's theories that change. Now, it does, but let's not go too far and think it leads to a kind of epistemic relativism of the postmodernism, because it doesn't directly lead to that as well. And Quine very much took against that when he realised people were taking it that way.
Yeah, I mean, for Quine, all this would mean is that we could still do things like metaphysics, or we can still make metaphysical assumptions, provided that the theories as a whole would remain true. And in fact, this is the grounding for Quine and Putnam and their philosophy of mathematics and accepting mathematical Platonism, the notion that there exist abstracta, mathematical entities that exist. They're non-spatial, non-temporal, they're not causally connected, unlike full-blooded Platonism, as Plato understood it. And for them, it was just because it connected to other branches of science as a whole, where they presume the existence of mathematical entities. So you could still do something like that, and it did provide an interesting way to reinvigorate metaphysical discourse.
Yeah. Cool. Do we want to now move into the text, or does anybody else have any thoughts kind of on the context of where it's at?
I think we should move into the text, because we're going to have to tie the two together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So let's get into analyticity. He talks about they're different. What does he call them? two different, at least two different senses, right? There was the unmarried, no unmarried, no unmarried man is married, and the bachelor is an unmarried man. There's the level of synonymy, but then there's kind of the first order that he doesn't seem to. He kind of moves right through, right?
Yeah, they're like logical truths and synonymous truths, kind of.
Right.
Yeah, he starts off. The first one is a very simple, straightforward, logical assertion, something along the lines of no. You could formalize it as no, not P is P. You know, it doesn't matter what P is. Yeah, it's a simple statement it's a simple logical deduction. Things get interesting when you start trying to introduce meaning and into that, because then you have to draw on the idea of synonyms, of things that mean the same, and on what grounds do they mean the same. So maybe it's that transition from the perfectly sort of straightforward logical deduction into questions of the meaning of synonyms is where he says, well, things start getting tricky here.
Yeah, do we want to talk? So on that second level, in terms of synonymy and in terms of a bachelor is an unmarried man, he gets into what is the correct definition, right? Like, how do you know that you're talking about the true definition for that a bachelor is synonymous with an unmarried man? And he kind of goes down a couple. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, what is synonymous? What is it to be synonymous? What do we draw on to be synonymous? If we're drawing on analyticity to mean synonymous, then, are we back where we started, perhaps?
Right,
this is the pattern that he keeps reintroducing, that when you try and disentangle these concepts that are taken almost to be bound together in an uncontroversial way, we find ourselves going in a circle, referring back to concepts that we're trying to define.
Right, that was very much with analyticity, with synonymy, right? A synonymy ends up seeming to double back on analyticity.
Yeah, he talks about being able, the criteria he suggests, because remember earlier on because he was and him and Carnap were personally close as well. He wrote in the 30s. Quine made his name first by writing things that were in support of Carnap, and he sort of said, well, back in those days, I would have gone with sort of like being interchangeable, salva verite. You can save the truth of something even though you change the one name for the other. It saves the truth of the statement. But he says but hold on, when I was doing that, I was actually drawing on the concept that I'm trying to define, analyticity. So I've got in a circle. And he goes through about 3 or 4 sort of iterations of this, trying to find out different ways, whether the thing is within the word itself, whether it's extensional meaning, which is, I think you've done a program on Frege, so you know the difference between extensional and intentional meaning, reference and sense. And he tried these different iterations. And yeah, the first 4, I think, sections, if I remember rightly, of the book are him try going through these and going, oh no, this isn't going to work. I think there's no distinction between. I think the analytic can be synthetic. Wow, mindfuck. I don't think he read that precisely, but that was the general gist of it. Anybody want to add? Sorry, I witted on there.
I'm trying not to mic hog. mainly so I don't fuck up. Okay, so so he goes into he's trying to get at what there are different methods he lays out, right? So in terms of interchangeability, that might be one way that you could determine whether you've ascertained the correct definition. But does anybody want to go into some of the issues he finds with interchangeability? No? Did anybody read? TJ, you want to take a? Huh?
No.
Do you want to take a stab at it, TJ? In terms of the problems with the interchangeability.
Yeah, I'll try. So he's looking for a way to substitute words so that the truth value of a particular statement is preserved regardless of the context those words are used. And he has a few little counterexamples that he kind of brushes off to the side, but still kind of demonstrate the real problem here. So people normally think bachelor and unmarried man are universally synonymous, but he comes up with several propositions that use the term bachelor that would not be true with the replacement of unmarried man. So he has like bachelor is a 10-letter word. You can't say unmarried man is a 10-letter word. So there are contexts. I mean, that's just he doesn't take those kind of objections too seriously because they're kind of a different nature than what he's really attacking. But it nonetheless demonstrates that you need to have some sort of structure of language that allows for this universal interchangeability. And in a lot of ways, I think having a language that does that in some sense presupposes analyticity to begin with.
Yeah, he in that section he talks with the interchangeability, isn't that where he talks about cognitive synonymy?
Yeah, that's sort of his buzzword for it is, if something is cognitively synonymous, that means that, in regardless of what context you're talking about, the two words should be preserve the meaning of the term. There's no distinction between the two. That would be I guess.
Kind of carves out an exception for the interchangeability or the nature of interchangeability in terms of scoping what it is we're referring to. We're not talking about form of the word or whatnot. We're talking about the cognitive substance or meaning for synonymy. And then he gets into talking about essentially dictionary or definitional terms, right? That we can always reference definitions, but that they themselves are collections of they assume synonymy, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it might be useful before we get into that is to first lay out, because I think Quine gives something like a definition of analyticity, like in maybe the first or second section, and he distinguishes two types of analytic truths. There's one class he doesn't have an issue with, logical truths. It's this more interesting class of, like you were giving the example of no bachelor is married,
whatever, he has no unmarried man is married is the first class, and then no bachelor is married is the second class. And the first is a logical is a logical truth, but the second is through I'm not sure what he refers to it as. What kind of truth he would refer that to? I guess an analytic truth or a.
He's saying you can't really. There's no way to really go from the second one to the first, and all the ways that have been presented as ways we do that, are actually don't hold up, right? Like, how do you go? How do you?
He says they're circular.
Yeah, they're circular, or they're in fact grounded in experience, or something. I mean, I'm not super familiar, obviously, but he's got several reasons why it doesn't work, and the one he talks about is, like, if you go to the dictionary, that doesn't really do it, because what is a dictionary except a recording of the way people are already talking? So there's nothing pure, right? Maybe it's about synonyms. So but in fact, synonyms don't work either, because synonyms presume the thing that synonyms are supposed to be explaining, and so you end up with, like, there's no way to really go from the second thing back to the first one.
A dictionary is a widely acknowledged synonym anyway. That's what dictionaries are collections of widely acknowledged synonyms. So you can't appeal to a synonym in order to understand a synonym.
Exactly, right.
And if you try and say, well, it's the way that you can substitute one for the other as a word, then you're back to analyticity, because it's based on biconditional rules of shared truth conditions. So you're back to where you started. So you haven't gone anywhere, and that's the difficulty he presents with regards to the second class, is that, well, if we're trying to say that no bachelor is married, and we're trying to understand what bachelor means, then we're in a circular position. So maybe the synthetic comes in here. So on that grounds we haven't proven that there's a proper distinction between the analytic and the synthetic. So we're
Yeah,
going to
you-
have to try something else.
That's right. And I think, I found that really compelling, and especially with this bachelor example, right? So, I mean, if you look at the example with parallel lines or something like that, the parallel lines one is similar to me to the bachelor one, right? So we used to think, parallel lines couldn't cross, and that was sort of just obviously true. You didn't need any experience. You didn't have to go draw a bunch of parallel lines. But now we know, because of the way space-time curves, parallel lines actually cross, right? And so now that's no longer analytic, quote unquote. But
Well,
in our culture now,
yeah, we found counterexamples. We set things are set up as
Yes, okay.
conditional operators running both ways, but we can find counterexamples which undermines them being necessarily true necessarily true in all circumstances. So oh dear, this is getting a bit tricky. It's like things that we thought were certain and given and uncontentious might not be as given and uncontentious as we thought they were.
right. And the same is even true of the classic bachelor sentence. I mean, there are hangouts now where you would be scoffed if you presented, bachelors are unmarried men because of the men thing, right? Right?
That would just be bizarre. Yeah, I know what you mean.
It seems bizarre to you, but nonetheless, I mean, I predict that we're going to have to come up with a better example, and pretty soon.
How about it? How about an Earth is a round object?
No, it's flat though.
No, I mean, but that it was good. That was quite compelling, right? I mean, so now what is left? Is there such a distinction? I really doubt it now.
This is where perhaps some of the later criticism has come in. That, well, hold on a minute, isn't this opening up the gateway to a complete kind of anarchy where people can believe whatever they want?
You're gonna say something, Max?
Oh yes, I'm actually curious as to how much of this does with the logical positivists changing the notion of analyticity from the way they presented it, as opposed to the way Kant tried to reformulate with the synthetic a priori. This notion that there are some synthetic statements that we know to be true. They reflect the outside world. They're not just contained in the predicate isn't contained within the subject, and yet this is something we can just go out and always experience. We'll never find, like
triangles have three sides would be one, right?
Triangles have three sides was one example. Bachelors are unmarried. I believe there was a time where we could have done that, but now that's more contentious. As we were just discussing now.
As well as bringing the distinction between analytic and synthetic into question here, remember there's also the question: is there a distinction between the a posteriori and the a priori?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, Kant maybe would have suggested something along the lines of, maybe we should just go back to thinking of statements like synonymous statements as being, a kind of linguistic truth, and that's something we put forward a priori, or something along those lines.
He in some of the interviews he has, those panels are wonderful. There's a couple of them. I didn't realize there were multiple, but there's a couple of them that he was on that are on YouTube. And he makes it clear that he's not against semantics, right? Like he's not challenging the whole enterprise of semantics. It's the true by definition is really the target for him. And along those same lines, Max, he seems to have like they raise that. They say, well, what about these truths that once you know them, let's say somebody's not using the language properly at first, but eventually they come to learn the meaning. Then can we say that it's analytic, or for them, or that it's the a priori synthetic distinction that Kant made, and he kind of he doesn't outright reject that, but he makes the point that those aren't the cases that he's concerned with. It seems like he's really concerned about he saw those as seemingly as a different category, that those weren't definitionally true. That you're saying it is, but Anyway,
I think
it
Kant's
might.
definition. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
I was just
would-
going to say that he had an experiment later on that he talks about that. I don't think it's in Two Dogmas, but there's the radical translation theory or example that he uses where two people go to record the language of a group of people, a culture that have radically different languages. There's no synonymy to, or there's no bilinguist or anything. They're going really to experience this for the first time, and they both record and build out a dictionary of terms and uses, and then they both come back, and both have done a good job getting at the meaning, but could have entirely different structures there.
That's the
right?
indeterminacy of translation.
Right. Yeah. But that seemed to poke at the notion of correct use. Once you know it, then it's true.
Oh, yeah. The only reason I was bringing it up was maybe as a way of, maybe a possible way of salvaging analyticity, and the synthetic. Not necessarily that there can be anything true by definition. But in any case, I actually have to get going for a baptism. I figured I'd have much more time because it doesn't start until 3 my time, but it's currently an hour and a half earlier than scheduled. In any case,
we enjoyed your pink room, Max.
I'm borrowing it from my cousin, but it is spectacular.
It's very nice. Particularly liking what's hung on the back of the door there. I thought, oh, you're going to be wearing that at the christening, are you?
No. If you think that's something, there's also a little mermaid statue as well behind me.
Oh, superb.
Fun.
Thank you for joining us, though, Max. It was nice to.
Yeah.
And you're gone.
Okay, so if we
we
reduce this analyticity down to simply being tautologies, then it's, who cares if those are real, right? I mean, you can't go anywhere with that.
Can we check with Hypatia? I had cut her off at one point, and I wanted to make sure that she got her thoughts out on.
Well, unfortunately, Max left. I was just going to tell him something about Kant's distinction between analytic and synthetic. All I was going to say was that the way from my understanding, the way he distinguished between analytic and the synthetic was narrower than the way the logical positivists distinguished between the two of them. Because, Kant famously said that where the logical positivist would have said something like 7 plus 5 equals 12 is an analytic truth, according to Kant, the analytic comes down to subject-predicate containment. And a truth is analytic to the extent that the subject in the proposition contains the predicate. And that process is governed by the rule of non-contradiction. And he wants to say that even, everyday arithmetical truths like 7 plus 5 equals 12 count as synthetic, not as analytic for him, because he doesn't think 12 is contained within the concept of 7 plus 5, whereas the logical positivists would disagree and take that to be an analytic truth instead. So his concept of the analytic was narrower than the way the logical positivists thought of it. That's all I was saying.
That's a really good distinction. I was glad you offered that. Helena, did you want to get back to... Sorry, I cut you off.
No, I'm just saying, it sounds like, I haven't heard anyone defending this definitional definition of the analytic, of an analytic statement, right? It seems like, at least so far anyway, we're all good with the thing Hypatia just said as being described as analytic. So, okay, so we could save it that way, but that doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't do anything, it doesn't help us in any kind of way.
Yeah, let me read one thing that he wrote here. He wrote that we still lack a proper characterization of this second class of analytic statements, and therewith of analyticity generally, inasmuch as we have had in the above description to lean on a notion of synonymy, which is no less in need of clarification than analyticity itself. So this whole portion dealing with analyticity is just trying to dig at what do we mean by what defines synonymy, and how do we know that that's true, or how I felt like that summarized the problem for him. Just getting at the characterization of what it is that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree, but the implications are pretty big, right? It means that the whole project is futile.
Well,
I don't know if he takes it that far.
Yeah, I don't think so.
He's not necessarily trying to undermine the notion of analyticity entirely and say there are no analytic truths. He's just saying that, you know, this once like indelible boundary between analytic and synthetic that people have taken, you know, as he says, as a metaphysical article of faith. He says, well, actually, we don't really have a proper justification for, you know, this boundary being so concrete. In fact, it's very difficult to draw a proper distinction between analytic and synthetic in many cases.
I would kind of want to argue, with all the caveats that I don't know anything, right? But that he was more radical than what you're suggesting. I think he actually was saying it's silly. We shouldn't even bother with this distinction.
I was watching the Boulos panel or whatever yesterday. It was one of the conversations he had in the 80s with a group, and he took the line that TJ did, where he was saying that he was saying that analytic truths haven't been shown. He doesn't know that they can be shown, but that it seemed like he was attacking the notion that it wasn't a dogma, that these things weren't articles of faith, but he himself he seemed a little softer on leveraging them.
He didn't go as far as Davidson did. Davidson went a little further and towards more what Helen is saying, and Quine said, well, no, not really, I wouldn't go that far. He's not throwing out the concept of analyticity altogether. And Hypatia makes a good point as well. There's not one straightforward account of what analytic means. The analytic of the logical positivists was extensional. It was in terms of objects, it was denoting references. That's why they saw 7 + 5 was 12, because they thought they were names for objects, whereas Kant thought differently. He didn't see them as much. He saw them as predicate subject containments. Yeah, but he didn't even throw out the logical positivist idea of analyticity altogether. He just said it couldn't be taken for granted or taken as being beyond eventual empirical revision. Which was radical enough. You know, you understand this was a breathtaking idea, that things that had been taken in memoriam in philosophy, the idea that there were these analytic truths, the things yielded themselves to knowledge merely by being analysed as concepts, indubitably so. You know, they were givens, they were beyond question. And Quine said, well, no, they might not be. Oh, that's scary enough.
He says one great quote. He says the word definition has come to have a dangerously reassuring sound, which I thought was just a great little bit, that it becomes this. I think he was fighting the certainty or the assuredness of it, or the.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, people were very certain about this. It was something. It was almost like scholasticism. It was something you were taught by your maesters, and you digested it well, and woe betide you if you questioned it. Hence, perhaps some of the reticence. You know, hence plus the Second World War. You know, and some of the reticence, and eventually some people got around to saying, well, you know, these things in logical positivism that we've been led to believe, they rooted back in Hume's fork, and you know, these kinds of distinctions, maybe they don't stand up. And then that's where you do start getting your Quines and your Sellers, people like that who come along and say, well, you know, maybe these things aren't just given. Maybe maybe we have to start looking at things holistically in terms of interconnected theories, you know, and we have to start questioning whether how firm our commitments within those theories are, even though they seem sort of indubitable, they might not be, you know. And this opens up a kind of radicalism. Now, you might argue that radicalism went too far. Yeah, and you end up with the epistemic anarchism of Feyerabend and people like that. Although Feyerabend was all right first, he only went a bit mad when he tried being down with the kids. That's what Feyerabend was. But you know,
there's a lesson to be learned there.
Yes, some of us are struggling with that even now.
You know, and that's a potential criticism. That where do you draw the line? It's always a good question. Where do you draw the line? But like I said before, it's a lot of people, even to this day, still try and undermine empiricism and naturalism by equating it with positivist assertions, yeah, and then knocking down the positivism and saying, go away, science. And I'm not just talking about people who are theistic. There's also people who have ideological reasons for doing this. There are people who don't like the idea of naturalism and empiricism in social science, who will make distinctions, for example, between the quantitative and the qualitative that are very much reminiscent of this distinction between the analytic and the synthetic. Yeah, and really they should pay attention to Quine's points as well. So it's still an ongoing issue. It still brings things to the fore that are worthy of discussion.
Okay, so let's go from the implications of, this blurring of analytic, if you want to call it a blurring, and synthetic, to connect it to the second part, which is the reductionism, because the two of them end up being. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, have we laid out the actual circularity charge? I mean, I'm not sure if, because we started talking about interchangeability, but I don't think we actually laid out the argument that he gives to show how, if you want to analyze analyticity in terms of substituting synonyms for synonyms to generate a logical truth, then, like in the interchangeability part, he talks about how in an extensional language, like Gary was talking about, where all you were talking about is just reference, that's not going to be sufficient to get what we take to be, to get a notion of synonymy. Like, I think one of the examples he uses is if we were only talking about an extensional language, if we were to substitute co-referring names within that extensional language to, say, generate synonymy, then take creatures with hearts and creatures with kidneys, which are co-referential in the actual world, and substituting in any sentence you please, you'll preserve the truth value, salve veritate, right? Every time you interchange, you'll preserve truth value within the actual world. But obviously, we don't take creatures with hearts to be synonymous with creatures with kidneys, right? So you have to move beyond an extensional language, one that's only dealing with reference, and possibly move to an intentional language, or introduce, as he goes on later, introduce the concept of necessity to characterize synonymy. So I think we need to first lay out the circularity.
But then does he go on to say that just means you have to presume necessity, and that in and of itself, just presuming necessity as an idea, is I guess an article of faith.
Yeah.
Well, I think circularity. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say he briefly talks about it, saying if you have like this universal qualifier of necessarily, meaning that you can say these two things are necessarily alike. Well, what you mean by necessarily really is like in some sense you mean that they're analytic.
Right.
I mean it's a roundabout way of just saying that they're analytic. So.
It's like the necessity relation between the conditional and the antecedent in a conditional operator. If you say if P then Q is necessary for P. If it's that kind of necessity, then we're back to where we started with analyticity.
It sounds like maybe there's another kind of necessity.
Well, I think it's important to remember the context of this paper, right? This is Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And as I mentioned before, like back when he published his 1936 paper, Truth by Convention, all the way back then he was attacking the logical positivist idea that we would explain the a priori in terms of the analytic. So for the logical positivists, all that necessity came down to was ultimately analyticity. So when he's saying that, well, when you're saying necessarily bachelors are unmarried, right, to, say, characterize synonymy, the logical positivists, given their own paradigm, have to accept that necessity just comes down to analyticity. So that's sort of the circle he's drawing. To analyze analyticity, we have to move to synonymy. To analyze synonymy, we have to move out of an extensional language to an intentional language, including something like necessity, right, to actually, so you don't get a truth like necessarily creatures with hearts are creatures with kidneys. You don't want that to become necessarily true to get synonymy, but a truth like necessarily bachelors are unmarried will turn out to be necessarily true. So you preserve, quote, synonymy. But then the logical positivists themselves analyze necessity in terms of analyticity. So we've moved from analyticity to synonymy to necessity back to analyticity. But
Round and
there's a
round we
core
go.
presumption
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
The core presumption there is that necessity. The core presumption is that necessity is analyzed in terms of analyticity. And if you reject that, Quine's argument may not carry as much force.
But then what's the difference between the necessity of all unmarried men being bachelors and all creatures with hearts being creatures with kidneys? What's the difference? What is non-analytic necessity? Is it, and wouldn't that be synthetic?
Well, I mean, that might be something we'd want to discuss maybe after the paper, but I mean, these days I don't think people equate the analytic with the necessary, especially post-Kripke, right?
No, they don't.
I mean, necessity is a metaphysical notion. Necessity continuity is a metaphysical notion. A priori, a posteriori is an epistemological notion, and analytic synthetic is a semantical notion, right?
Right.
And those can be distinguished from each other. So, I mean, these days, if people are accepting, the post-Kripke take on those ideas, I don't think. I mean, that's something we'd have to discuss later. But
Yeah,
I'm just saying
that in itself isn't clear cut. Well, there's no clear cut consensus on what the relationships in those cases between the semantic, the epistemic, and the ontological are either. But it's Quine. The important thing about Quine is he moved the debate on towards where we are now and away from just assuming that these distinctions are a given.
Right. But all I'm saying is just in the context that he's responding in, you can see how he's drawing the circularity argument, given he's operating off the logical positivist's own set of presumptions to make that circularity true.
Sure.
You illustrated that really nicely. I appreciate that. Thank you for laying that out. So do we want to now slide into the dogma of reductionism?
Well, I want to, because the important thing is how they're linked.
Yeah, and I think it's easier to see the implications of this problem through the lens of like the verification theory of meaning, because it has much broader implications for science, which aren't necessarily apparent from the first half.
TJ, do you want to take a stab at the verification theory of meaning?
Okay, so as he presents it, the verification theory of meaning is a way of defining like the meaning of a particular phrase as the way you determine its truth, or the way you empirically verify it, he says so. Let's see. So I guess, I'm not too familiar with the context of this this kind of notion of meaning, but he essentially argues that when you actually try to boil down how it is you relate some empirical investigation of meaning to the statement itself, you start to run into problems, because there's no clear-cut way that you should draw conclusions about your investigations to conclusions about these particular statements. And ultimately, he argues that this hinges on the same problem of this analytic and synthetic distinction. I don't know how much I can say all at once about that, but I think it's an outline of it.
Anybody else want to offer thought? So, so in terms of, does somebody want to talk about how he ties the issues with analyticity? Helena, you seemed pretty passionate about that. Did you want to take a stab at maybe chatting about how that ties to?
I can't do it for a second. I can't.
Okay. The dogs must be going on.
Well, it's not the dogs; it's other things happening in the house. But I think if we go through the reductionist thing, and then we can see how they're connected. It was really tough for me. I just sort of got a glimpse of it this morning, how it is that they're connected and why they're connected. So maybe we explain the reductionist thing first, and then we work on trying to connect them.
Right. Okay.
I'll be right back.
I guess I can probably clarify what I said. So he presents the verification theory of meaning as one that is going to reduce, I guess, statements of experience to kind of statements of fact in some way, and saying that if you have some particular statement that you're putting forward that you want to have meaning, the meaning of that statement is determined by how it reduces to a series of facts or statements of facts. I think, and so there. Let's see. He has a bunch of little quotes about it, but and I guess
statements of facts. And by statements of fact, you're talking about experience, essentially through experiences.
Right. Yeah. Like statements about the world that you can verify through science was kind of the end goal of this theory, because you wanted meaning to be somehow tethered to scientific knowledge, I think. And so I guess he's drawing from Carnap on this. Mm-hmm. But I guess the general scheme was, by boiling statements of experience down to statements of facts, you can somehow, using a notion of analyticity and synonymy and whatnot, you should, in theory, be able to, I guess, substitute these statements of facts using, synonymous notions into kind of logical statements or logical truths in a way, because as he talks about in the first half, those two kinds of analyticity. If you have a notion of synonymy, like a coherent notion of synonymy that you have, then you can reduce a synonymous statement to a logical statement just by interchanging words. So if you start off with a statement of experience, say that I see this red car in front of me and whatnot, and then you can transpose that into a statement of a series of facts about the world, which is, there's this car in front of me that has these kind of dimensions, whatnot, and it's perceived by me visually through these set of processes. Then I guess you can further reduce, those empirical statements, those scientific classifications, somehow into logical truths by importing this notion of synonymy. So you can say, by switching synonyms for synonyms, you can ultimately arrive at some logical statement from an experiential statement. I think that was the general program that he was presenting and then going to kind of attack using the criticism from the first half. I don't think I did a very good job of explaining how it works, though. But
well, he has a whole portion where he talks about a sense datum language, right? And that that you need to be able to what Carnap failed to do was demonstrate something where you can take these experiences and then cash them out in a language that you end up with things that are seemingly unreducible, right? He has the is at portion where he's talking about quality Q is at point instant X Y Z T. But I'm with Helena in that I understand loosely how the analyticity the first dogma becomes problematic through synonymy for reductionism, but the tie is much looser for me. I was starting to get the feeling that I wasn't quite grasping the whole thing.
Are you familiar with the verification theory of meaning, which was also a very big part of logical positivism?
Yeah, I was only briefly acquainted with it, so I was kind of scratching my head trying to figure out how he was arguing for it and whether or not that was a good presentation of it.
It's the idea that the meaning of a statement is the means of its verification, the way you test whether it's true or you establish that it's true. And the second dogma starts because he realizes that if you had a theory if the theory of verification was true, you could say, well, look, it does have analyticity, it does have meaning. It's the self-justifying statements of logical assertions. They're self-justifying, and you can sort of refer to these self-justifying logical truths. Which familiar foundational truth of logic. But he spots problems in that, especially in terms of the way that what's verified in verificationism is single expressions, single propositions that seem to make reference to direct experience. Yeah. And that's where he discovers the second dogma, in that idea that it is single statements that that refer to direct experiences, which are said by the logical positivists to stand in front of the tribunal of empirical research. And he says, well, hold on, that isn't right. And that's how he moves from the analyst. He's originally, because remember, he's starting off by going through different approaches where he might be wrong about this. You know, the analyticity might be distinct from the synthetic. And he gets to this point, well, if verification isn't true, then surely they're just these self-verifying, you know, almost, you know, indubitably given truths, axioms. They're axioms. They're the basic axioms of our thought. But then he goes on, well, hold on, what do logical positivists hold as these axioms? They're single statements that refer to direct experiences, and that's how he moves from the first part to the second.
Yeah,
if that helps clarify.
I mean, when he comes into reductionism, he first starts out with radical reductionism, right? And he talks about how it's, you know, it becomes just intolerably narrow. What does he say? Intolerably restrictive of being a term by term critique, and that's clearly true, right? I mean, you couldn't boil every term down individually to a singular experience in that sense.
But that's what the logical positivists. That was a consequence of that, right? I mean,
right, exactly.
That was logical positivists, yeah.
That was part of their program, yeah.
Though, Gary, would you say? Oh, I'm sorry. Go.
No, I mean, I did have a question when I read it. In the beginning, he seems to define analyticity as apart from synthetic in the fact that analyticity is apart from experience or apart from empirical verification in that sense. And it seems like when we get to reductionism, it almost switches and goes the other way, in which you know, we're reducing things to logical truths, but that seems to be, we seem to be saying that it's cashed out in terms of experience. Is that, am I misreading that, or is it?
That's how I read it too. I was a bit unsure of that.
Yeah. Because it felt like it almost changes the way in which we're describing the term synthetic, but I did notice that he redefined analytic a couple times throughout the paper, so it might just be a result of who he's addressing or what critique he's addressing.
Well, he tries off different ideas of analyticity, because remember, he's critical. This is the Two Dogmas is almost like a testimony of struggles that he has gone through himself over the years. Yeah, where he's tried to save the commitments he had to the logical positivism of Carnap, who was his mentor. So he tries different conceptions of analytic, he tries to rescue them from these difficulties that he sees. And he goes through the first, I think, 3 or 4 sort of iterations of this and goes, well, okay, this isn't working. But if we approach it via verificationism, where the meaning of something is its means of verification, and we verify something because it's true in all, absolutely, you know, it's a necessary truth in all truth conditions because it's an analytic truth, then maybe we can save it that way. But then he realizes that, well, the way the positivists do this, at least, rests on a particular conception of what it is that's being verified, and he sees that there are problems with that, you know, and that's where he goes, oh well, this is the second dogma. It's related, it comes from trying to rescue the first, but it leads to the second, and these are the last 2 sections of his book, and he writes about it more in Word and Object in 1961, and Sellers in Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind is a good 1958 is a good supplement to this as well.
It certainly seemed like the first dogma gave people more issue than the second. Like the reductionism when I was going through and reading other people or watching other things. It seemed like the analyticity dogma.
Initially, yes, but then you have to consider people suddenly, I think, twigged on to this idea that, hold on, what he's saying here is that what we're testing isn't statements. You know, we go around thinking that we're making assertions and testing the truth of assertions. No, it's the whole corporate bodies of assertions, theories, worldviews, ideas. They all stand or fall together. I mean, so if you so slight cosmetic, what you might think of slight cosmetic changes in one part of a theory might instigate a calamitous collapse of a faith or a worldview or an ideology or things that are very deeply held. So yeah, initially people go, oh, this tradition of analytic synthetic distinction is really important, and there's this other stuff over here which is the reductionism. Yeah, but I think it dawned on people that this second one is really kind of like impactful as well. That this is dynamite. This is a hidden charge. There's one detonation, and as people are just sort of reeling from that one, the second one goes off. So it was actually quite sort of like a double whammy, so to speak.
Yeah, maybe it's because because of my recent experience with the Quine book and other things, it seemed less controversial to me.
Because you can be traveling at it backwards in history. That's
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's hard for me to see it any other way, but I guess people did. That's obviously you wouldn't have had to write it otherwise. So do we want to say more about reductionism, or do we want to talk kind of about his concept of holism and kind of where this all kind of led for Quine?
Well, did we settle as to how the first dogma relates to the second here?
Gary seemed like he
pretended to.
I feel like, and it's just a feeling I got, right? But it feels like he's saying that they're actually the same. It's the same problem.
Well,
yeah, he does say that.
They're exactly the same, right?
The one led from the other. The one led from the other.
Right.
Started off dealing with the first, and then he came to a situation where he realised there was a second dogma nested in a necessary response to the first.
Yeah,
and I mean that's the relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that sort of goes to my question. How I saw it progressing was that at the beginning there's a distinction between analytic and synthetic that is involved with sense data and experience, and then as we sort of dissolve the boundary between the two, we sort of are forced to accept that sense experience is probably part of the analytic statement, but we're just talking about the logical truth of it. And I felt that that's how he moved towards this sense of reductionism, and then trying to expand that into a larger sense of verification.
The problem with that would be there's no analytic a posteriori. Things that come to our senses aren't from a logical positivist point of view. The things that come to our senses aren't necessary truths, aren't analytic.
Right.
He says. Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say. He starts off that portion though saying that if we allow the verification theory meaning, that then there's an account for synonymy can be found within there. But then, and I think that's kind of what leads him down the charge of attacking the verification theory through the dogma of reductionism, right? Isn't that how they kind of loosely tie together?
Sure, but Hypatia does have a point. We need to talk about the second dogma itself as well before moving on to holism.
Well, there's two paragraphs I think that are very helpful in seeing just how directly he ties. Like, I know we sort of have this vague idea. I feel like we sort of had a vague idea of how they tie together, but I think it's probably more helpful if we make it explicit. There's two paragraphs that I think really home in on how specifically he's tying them together. I think they're in the middle of section 5, or towards the bottom end of section 5. So I'll just read them out loud if that's all right, because I think the import is fairly clear.
Of course it's all right.
So he says, but the dogma of reductionism has, in a subtler and more tenuous form, continued to influence the thought of empiricists. The notion lingers that to each statement, or each synthetic statement, that there is associated a unique range of possible sensory events such that the occurrence of any of them would add to the likelihood of the truth of the statement. And there is associated also another unique range of possible sensory events whose occurrence would detract from that likelihood. This notion, of course, is implicit in the verification theory of meaning. Skipping a paragraph, the dogma of reductionism, even in its attenuated form, is intimately connected with the other dogma, that there is a cleavage between the analytic and the synthetic. We have found ourselves led, indeed, from the latter problem to the former through the verification theory of meaning. more directly, the one dogma clearly supports the other in this way. As long as it is taken to be significant in general, to speak of the confirmation and information of a statement, it seems significant also of a limiting kind of statement which is vacuously confirmed, ipso facto, come what may, and such a statement is analytic.
Well, I think in our Skype group, Huge Idiot Reyes, who some of you people may know from G+, he made an interesting comment here, which is that verificationism could save analyticity because on verificationism, two statements could be synonymous if they're verified by the same sense data. So if in fact that reductionism is unsound, then verificationism can't save analyticity.
Yep.
Right. But yeah, I mean, it's clear, I think, with those two paragraphs how he's drawing that precise distinction, because when it comes to confirming a particular statement, we have to have an idea as to what would count in favor of it or would not count in favor of that statement, which itself requires a notion, as he's saying, a cleavage of a sort between the analytic and the synthetic, the sorts of statements that could be subject to confirmation or disconfirmation by experience, and the others that sort of stand outside of it fundamentally. Insofar as they try to analyze confirmation or verification on an individual level, sort of a statement by statement level, and then, like Gary was saying, the move that Quine is making instead, perhaps, is that rather than analyzing statement by statement, we are subjecting the entire corpus of our theories to, as he says, the tribunal of, I think, sense experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. It's gone very quiet.
I was just thinking that second. I was going back over and over again on that second paragraph. So.
Well, I think what it's sort of pointing to is that this is not a very localized issue for Quine. This issue about holism ends up connecting to these larger questions, like in Quine's philosophy, like the indeterminacy of radical translation and semantic indeterminacy and so on. So a lot of people actually were resistant to the attack on the analytic-synthetic distinction precisely because they didn't want to follow Quine.
Sure. Yeah. Like Grice and Strauss and in defense of a dogma. Yeah. No. But Quine, of course, it's by 1961. Of course, this is where Quine wrote Word and Object. This is we move on to the next Quine book. But yeah, this set the discussion during the 1950s. Quine published it in book form with other essays in 1953, and other people responded, and then at the beginning of the 60s, Quine wrote his Word and an Object, where he introduced his indeterminacy of translation and so forth as his response. But we can see from that this is a game changer. This text is why it's a major text in the history of Anglophone philosophy, because it basically changed the game. It put an end to the chapter which you could call the logical positivist, the high modernism of the early 20th century, and paved the way for what you could call the post-positivism of the latter half of the 20th century. It's quite impressive for a single monograph to do that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting here, this last bit here, especially these two lines right here where he says it's present suggestion that it's nonsense and the root of much nonsense to speak of a linguistic component and a factual component in the truth of any individual statement. Coming with some pretty strong language, but I'll go ahead and go back to normal. So.
And he sort of left it with that as well. He left them wanting more, which is always a good tactic.
It was interesting to me to see some of the later interviews in his life, people still coming back and in the conversations with him, I don't know that they were trying to salvage the idea as much as understand his beef with it, but it certainly seemed like it at times. It seems like it's a difficult thing to kind of how this can't be the case, right? How in what sense is it the case if we can't justify it? What are we salvaging it here, or what are we gonna move on from it, or it seemed like it really left people confused.
People were dealing with it. It's something this high impact. People are going to have to reorientate and deal with it. And yeah, a lot of late 20th century, and to some extent to this day, has been reorientating as a consequence of this kind of bombshell.
Yeah. I mean, I think he even brings it up. He seems really sympathetic to Carnap in the fact that at least Carnap was attempting to start the reduction, to look at reductionism as a dogma, and was really trying to cash it out in that sense. And he points out that people sort of assumed that this distinction was just not well sketched out. It was just sort of like a really hypothetical idea rather, and that we were discussing it in terms of artificial languages, and that to get to the real source we would have to come up with something as complex as ordinary language. And so there was definitely this sense that people were on the right track with the distinction, but they were just not quite sketching it out in full detail. And I think he sort of goes the other way with it. He says, no, you're going the wrong direction with it. That the distinction is actually illusory, and that we need to start with the analyzing ordinary language.
Well, this is ordinary language philosophy influenced by the latter work of Wittgenstein was in prominence at the same time as this as well. So yeah, that there was almost a historical nature to this. Like there's the high modernism of the early 20th century where people are very reductive and they break it down and they want to make the world new and simplify it. And then after the Second World War and as things move on, people realise no, it's more nuanced, it's more rooted in ordinary experience, and there's a move, and then you get to the 60s, and yeah, this is of its time. This is clearly of its time in some sense.
I actually had a question for you, Gary, just maybe before we move on to reductionism bit. I'm not as familiar maybe with some of the history of the Vienna Circle and whatnot, but I was just wondering, do you think, because my understanding is that Neurath, when in discussion with Carnap, he influenced Carnap to move from this more phenomenalistic, almost idealistic, approach to verification and meaning, like where it would all reduce down to sense experience, which is almost Barkelian in nature in a certain sense.
Sure, yeah.
And he convinced him, or I guess influenced him, to move to a more physicalistic approach or a more physicalistic language for talking about. So rather than talking about individual sense experiences, we could talk about actual physical objects, right? So I'm just wondering that in that context, do you think that what Neurath was doing there was already sort of an attenuation of the reductionist project, or
yeah, because there was a whole host of it. It's a bit like a swan. There was something on the surface that looked quite sedate and settled, but there was a lot of flapping about going underneath in logical positivism. There was a lot of debate. There was a lot of exploration of different iterations and different ways of dealing with these fundamental concepts, or not fundamental concepts, but these ideas that had come out from logical positivism and from the Tractatus and things like that. There was a lot of debate going on. So yeah, and some of it was heading away from kind of from phenomenalism and sort of the ontologies and methodologies of idealism, and exploring more materialistic conceptions. Like I think A.J. Ayer probably had a say in that as well. And these people were actually meeting and discussing these things in as early as the late 20s, but certainly by the early 30s. There was dissent, and there was friendly dissent, and people were actually sort of like engaged in a research project together. Well, where can we take these ideas? Which of these options is better? So yeah, there was things were drifting away from. There wasn't a single settled doctrine. I think sometimes logical positivism is seen as being a single doctrine set by a particular corpus of texts, and it wasn't. It was a big debate lots of coffee was drunk and lots of pastry was consumed in Vienna with regards to these issues.
What I find sort of interesting is that some of these logical positivists, in a certain sense, went on to become some of their most effective critics. Like, Quine studied under Carnap, for one,
Yeah.
and Hempel was associated with the logical positivist movement for a while, but he himself, went on to attack it in philosophy of science, and he attacked their verification criterion of meaning. So yeah, I mean, I think it is sort of like a misconception, I suppose, to think of them as sort of a homogeneous monolith.
I see monolith of logic. No, there was definite conversation and discourse going on, which ultimately benefited analytic philosophy, especially a great deal as the years went on.
It seemed like even with the Tractatus playing a large role in kind of getting that moving, at least, or maybe in the middle of it. I'm not sure where it falls in the history of positivism, but it seems like even Wittgenstein, towards the latter half, had taken different views from where he was with the Tractatus.
Oh, sure. Definitely, yeah, absolutely. He's by the time you get to his posthumously published, but we worked on it for a long time before, philosophical investigation. It was, of course, it's one of the, just like his Tractatus was perhaps one of the foundational texts of logical positivism. The Investigations is one of the foundational texts, of course, of ordinary language philosophy.
Right.
Yeah. And he'd undergone very radical changes, and yeah, this is part of the movement that was going. Ideas don't stand still, debates don't stand still. The thinking that people contribute changes, as both in light of events and in light of the intellectual stimulation that they get from other people working on the same problems. And this is good. This is why philosophy is not the moribund thing that people sometimes criticize it for being. It's not dead. It's not. We're not all discussing exactly the same problems as we were 2,000 years ago. It's not quite that bad.
Yeah. I'm laughing because I have a video I'm working on right now, which actually is on Analyticity, and it's got a quote in there of Trey Jadlow saying that these G+ers think that there's been philosophy in the last 100 years when it was all figured out with pre-Socratics. So
why are you all bothering?
What are we doing here? So do we want to move into talking about holism and Quine's views, or even, we've already talked about it quite a bit, but even moving into kind of our own feelings about the text and thoughts about.
Would that be section 6? Empiricism without. I was following along section by section, but.
Right, we can go through empiricism without the dogmas, if you'd like.
I mean, unless you guys don't think it would be helpful. I mean, it's just,
I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, I actually really like that section.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the way he illustrated the relationship between our notion of concepts and their utility in science, and how they're all malleable in a sense, and that if you change one, you change the other and whatnot. You kind of have to keep them all updated.
Yeah, do you want to continue?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. So he presents this view of the relationship between kind of experience and science. I think science, he just kind of broadly construes it as these empirical methods that we determine things about the world. And I mean, there are a lot of great quotes in this section. But he presents experience as being sort of at the periphery of this enterprise, this enterprise of acquiring knowledge, I guess you could say. And so, our experience constrains how we look about the world, or how we look at the world. We have to come up with a model of the world that's consistent with our experience, and that's sort of our starting point, is our experience. And along the way, if we have, a realization that, some aspects of our experience are somehow different than we initially perceived, then we have to sort of accordingly update all of these areas of science and whatnot that were sort of predicated on that set of observations in a way. And it's not just science. I mean, he gives examples in math of like rational numbers and irrational numbers, and how there was a time when irrational numbers hadn't really been conceived of, and we didn't know what to do with them. But eventually, when you start looking at like quadratic equations, you find that you have equations where you don't have a solution in terms of numbers that you're familiar with. So like like the square root of 4 you can write as like plus or minus 2. That's simple. But what about the square root of 3? You kind of have to from then extend your notion of what constitutes a number and what kind of numbers you're allowed to have, and you sort of update your mathematics accordingly based on this new discovery or this new kind of experience of mathematics. And I don't know, let's see. There's a really good quote that I love because like when I do physics, this was like so relevant. But he says, like total science is like the field of force whose boundary conditions are experienced, meaning that like when you solve differential equations and whatnot, you start off with these boundary conditions that kind of mold the solution that you end up with. When you have different boundary conditions, you have different solutions, and he's talking about this in terms of experience via different experiences and different realizations about the world will mold your understanding of science and reshape it as you go. It's just, I don't know. I really like the way he illustrated the relationship between all of that.
Yeah, it was also when Max was talking earlier about quantum mechanics and probabilities and superpositions. It reminded me of his portion on germaneness, that there are things on the edge of our periphery that we're struggling to explain, but that they have some selective tie to other experiences, and that these things kind of we hold it within a framework. I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and he really kind of argues that there's not much of a distinction to be had between philosophy and science in that sense. It's not like these are like separate academic traditions. They're kind of necessarily related. Maybe I shouldn't say necessarily, given that we just talked about that, but they're all intertwined very closely in that the revolutions in one field will kind of spark revolutions in the other in terms of how you come to understand the world and the concepts you use to describe it.
Yeah, I liked that as well. The tie between the experience and the kind of theory laden or the concept laden framework that it sits in. He does a good job of tying the two. He talks about that, about blurring the notion of the line being blurred between metaphysics and science, and that he makes a good case for it in this portion.
There's one part, although I guess it may be my own biases speaking through, but there's one part in this section that I really like when he talks about the way physical objects are construed, just basically analogous to the Homeric gods. They're just ultimately useful posits that are used to simplify experience, but that difference is ultimately the difference between talking in terms of a phenomenalistic language or a physicalistic language is just a difference in degree, not a difference in kind. So to the extent that it's positing it as useful, it's to that extent that he talks about it as being superior in one fashion or another. In the same way that you were talking about the irrational numbers. He talks about how we pretend the irrational numbers are there, if only to simplify certain ways of thinking about phenomena and allowing us to predict and explain other phenomena. But ultimately, they're posits, no different than the Homeric gods in a certain fashion.
Yeah, I liked this last line here. The myth of physical objects is epistemologically superior to most, in that it is proved more efficacious than other myths as a device for working as a manageable structure into the flux of experience. There's just this whole section is really chock full of really big statements.
It's chock full of its possibilities. Yeah, you can sort of see the possibilities of what he's saying. It's like the closing sections of Darwin's Origin of Species. It leaves you thinking, and it leaves you thinking along a very broad horizon as well, which is a really nice way to end a paper.
Yeah, I quite liked this version that I found online too, because to see where he edited out of the later portions was kind of interesting. That's not really relevant to what we're talking about now, but
Was that the DI text one?
yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. I really like this section as far as it's I don't know, maybe it is getting into the idea, he's sort of hinting at the idea of indeterminacy in our assessments, because he's talking about how that field of science is sort of undetermined, and that there's, what does he say, there's much latitude of choice in what statements we end up reevaluating, and in the light of contrary experience, right? So that we sort of assess each the truth value of a contrary experience in light of an entire field of experience that we've already had, and we sort of weigh it against the simplicity of it, and all the changes we're going to have to make in the totality of the field is something that we're thinking about when we're trying to assess the truth value of an experience,
right?
Or a statement, yeah. And I don't know. I think in that way he shows that there's sort of this level of indeterminacy that we're always going to be beset with. That really we're going to come at it from a holism that's very almost individual to our experience.
It's going to make us have an open mind. We are not going to be overly dogmatic. We're not going to think we know it all and we've got a perfect system wherein we can accommodate for anything. It makes us responsive to the world. It maintains our commitments to being able to accurately predict and properly explain and have some quality explanation of phenomena. But it sort of also cautions us against, rather like Kant does in some respects, being overly assertive and overly certain in our metaphysical, especially in our metaphysical assertions of what must necessarily be the case, or what things are really like, that we know we have the final analysis. And I think that's often a virtue of good philosophy. It cautions us against conceit, because it's very easy, perhaps particularly easy if you think you're dealing in necessary conceptual truths, to think, well, this settles it. I know, I don't have to think about that anymore. I've got that beat down pat, and it cautions us against that.
Mm-hmm.
It's hand in hand with which is about paradigms that normal science occurs, and that you kind of build up these things that you aren't necessarily questioning, but you're having problems with, and that science just kind of continues under this paradigm until these radical shifts occur. But you kind of science has to kind of proceed that way, that you have to continue through these things, assuming some things, just to keep the rest of it going. And it's a little like our beliefs, right? It's about how it's kind of the same way that we go about, or we should go about operating in the world, where you have to function on a daily basis, and you kind of do so with all these built-in assumptions that you don't recognize or you don't see, but you need them there in order to function. It's a little like the Homeric. It's like the Homeric gods, right? It's
yeah.
And then
things that make you change your mind accrue. There's not a single flash where the whole system rearranges geometrically at the speed of light or something. Right. It's the things accrue, and you adapt. And the beauty of this kind of approach, perhaps, is it offers us some guidance as to how best to do that, how to commit our heuristics, the way we change our beliefs in the face of contrary evidence. What do we keep? What do we throw away? When? It's not that we should have it's not that we have a set of commitments that we're just not prepared at all ever to question. Yeah. But at the same time, it's not completely fluid. It's not all mush. So anything, we could just throw away the most important things straight away, off the bat, given the first piece of disconfirmation. It offers a consistency, a sort of just a porridge that is just right, neither too hot and squishy or too lumpy. It offers us some guidance as to how to have a reasonably firm approach to reevaluating our beliefs.
Yeah, I like that. It's almost like a dual sort of pragmatism, where it's the pragmatism of being able to manipulate and transmit these ideas, but also this pragmatism of being able to have a secure footing, or a way to have a totality in which we actually can assess these ideas.
Sure.
You need some level of consistency to even maintain any sort of systemic assessment like that.
Sure. Practically, we need to trust that our beliefs are at least accurate in their predictions, and and also we appreciate the value of explanations that are efficient, and rational, not too liable to succumb to fallacy. And also ones that are neither so flexible as to be irrefutable, or so flexible as to not to be able to deal with counterfactual situations. So there are certain virtues that theories have that we should pursue, and we should cherish those values without thinking that they're based on a irrefutable faith in a certain set of propositions or ideas. And so it makes us more agile and also more questioning, but we don't completely fall apart in an epistemological squidgy mess either. That's perhaps the legacy of this kind of empirical naturalistic thinking. Whereas you could say the positivists were a little bit too rigid, perhaps. A little bit too rigid, a little bit too key on the sweeping scope of their systems, whereas the post-positivists were a little bit more pragmatic. Yeah, pragmatic's a good word. It returns to a kind of pragmaticism. Yeah.
Do you know if his in terms of his own perspectives, did he believe in objective truths, or I didn't get the sense that he didn't, but he certainly sounded borderline pragmatist, like in terms of a pragmatic theory of truth.
But in a way, it's highly impractical not to believe in objective truth in some senses. If you're going to cross the road, the objective reality of lorries is a useful posit. I
think he brings up that that we our language is developed in a social context, right? So that in a way, like when we posit something like an objective physical object or something like that, the development of our language sort of necessitated that we have some sort of intersubjective reference, and so he kind of puts it that way, that we're only doing it pragmatically in order to really describe something to someone else, right? We're sort of trying to manipulate that reference rather than really individually talk about something objective.
So like a social constructivist or something like that, or?
Well, it's just constructivism to some degree. I don't think it entails a complete social constructivism. This actually goes back to interesting things about the history of continental philosophy and the interpretations of Kant, and it's particularly Kant's ideas of what constitutes a transcendental category, but a category that's true by necessity, because we tend to inherit a German idealist tradition that minimizes it rather severely down to cause, space, and time. There's very little in Kant himself that actually means that must be the interpretation we take. We tend to get that from Reinhold and Fichte and people who were interpreting Kant. And the idea we can have perhaps things that are transcendental, that are categories in the Kantian sense, that are more day-to-day and pragmatic, like a sense of some idea, some conception of reality, some conception of mind independence, some conception of tangibility, that are necessary for performing the forms of life, the language games that we are playing, and and in that role they become categorical in some sense. And that's a possibility, a possible line of inquiry that stems perhaps from this post-positivist interpretation. I think so, anyway. Sorry, am I waffling on? I do apologize.
That's fine. I think we're getting to the point of kind of closing thoughts for people on this.
Well, one thing that I find interesting is just sort of the development of Quine's thoughts here. Like sort of the first section, you can see how it's related to his 36 paper, Truth by Convention, where he attacks this idea that you can explain the a priori in terms of like the analytic or something. He offers sort of a dilemma there. But this closing section, if you read his paper On What There Is, which is another very famous paper, on what there is, the closing sections of this paper, Two Dogmas, is very similar to the closing sections of On What There Is, where he talks about this very same idea, that when we're choosing between two conceptual schemes, say between a phenomenalistic and a physicalistic scheme, or a Platonistic and a nominalistic scheme, or whatever sorts of schemes that we're choosing between, that decision is ultimately on the level of practicality, which one is more useful fundamentally to us. And the way he closes On What There is, from among the various conceptual schemes best suited to these various pursuits, one, the phenomenalistic, claims epistemological priority. Viewed from within the phenomenalistic conceptual scheme, the ontologies of physical objects and mathematical objects are myths. The quality of myth, however, is relative in this case to the epistemological point of view. This point of view is among various corresponding to one among our various interests and purposes. So this ties in, I think, very neatly to how he's talking about, like in the case of the physicalistic and the phenomenalistic picture, or like, not sure if it was it you, John, or was it TJ that was bringing up the thing about the irrational numbers that Quine was bringing up in context of the rationals. All of that, in some fashion or another, you could take to be mythical in some sense. That this question of are they really there, in some sense, becomes idle, because in a certain sense, the more important question is, to what extent do they facilitate our ability to make sense of the world, to predict our experiences, and so on and so forth. So this is sort of, I think, the move that he's making at the end of the paper, where this ties into what we're talking about, him being more of a pragmatist ultimately, perhaps more so than even the logical positivists were themselves.
Oh, certainly. I mean, it does come to the issue of whether things that are, if they're there in any noumenal sense, is whether it's relevant or whether it's interesting or not, and perhaps it's not as interesting as people make it out to be. Interesting developments along these lines, of course, was soon taken up by people like Sellers, with his distinction between the manifest image and the scientific image, and the debate that followed from that with regards to how would you classify them? If we were going to categorize them in an Aristotelian terms, in which is the more substantive and which is the more accidental, how would you categorize the difference between the manifest image and the scientific image? And of course, a large section of post-positivist materialism, people like the Churchlands and Dennett and people like that, have been their tactic has been to substantialize the scientific image and then explain the manifest and the phenomenal, try and perform some kind of reduction or elimination or revision of the accidental phenomenal realm in terms of the materialistic realm. So it's certainly shaped fields like philosophy of mind, for example.
I wanted to his clowning around with TJ and John in the side chat there. I wanted to mention somebody mentioned in the side chat, I think Joe Sonseed had talked about the Quine thesis, which is which does follow from all of this in terms of not being able to test a given hypothesis because of all the underlying assumptions. Right. Yeah. When you're testing a theory, you're testing the entire framework. But I think we somewhat talked about that quite a bit.
Well, I think what's interesting though is that for the audience, we've gone through this whole discussion, and a lot of people are maybe perhaps want to think of this. Oh, this is just some sort of highbrow philosophical issue, right? Like, how does this matter in some sense? But what's interesting, sort of myself having a background in science, I like to try to keep, my background is in biology, but I try to keep up with physics and other things. You can see how this affects the way scientists actually think about theories and other things. Like, wasn't there that they had this one experiment, I think, with Cherenkov radiation, where people were claiming they had found particles that could travel faster than the speed of light, right? And what was the fallout of that? The fallout was that, well, I guess we have to throw Einstein into the trash bin, right? That wasn't the fallout. What they did instead is they examined the auxiliary assumptions, which were, well, was the experiment done correctly? Were the instruments calibrated correctly? You know, like rather than taking that to say overthrow 60, 70 years, well, actually longer, I suppose, of, you know, verified or confirmed science. Like by the time we've committed very strongly, you know, to this framework that we've developed. Because I mean, general and special relativity, it's ubiquitous in the way that, you know, we use, like, you know, when they do like satellite trajectories, the way NASA thinks about things. I mean, it's if we were wrong about that, you know, we'd be wrong about a lot of things. So the fallout of that wasn't, again, to reject special and general relativity. The fallout was to examine the auxiliary assumptions behind saying that this did, in fact, falsify that, you know, the speed of light is a hard limit. So you can see, like, how those kinds of things affect scientists. I know that myself, when I did research in the past, you know, you would do experiments and sometimes you would get wonky results, right? And what you would conclude is not that those were the results, but you would go back and examine, like, your protocol or examine your instruments or other sorts of things. So this sort of interaction, this sort of idea that we don't test individual statements, or that observations don't, the idea that a single observation could overthrow, like, say, an entire theory or an entire framework, is not just a strictly philosophical issue. It's one that has actual practical consequences in the way that scientists themselves practice on a day-to-day basis, and as well as on the higher theoretical level.
Well, philosophy of science is very important for scientists.
Right.
I find myself saying this a lot.
That sounds familiar.
That's the very, I mean, the same token, that's the very reason why radical theories are rejected almost immediately, like, you know, relativity or whatnot, right? Is that it impacts an entire framework that's assumed it for a long time, and that goes a little bit towards. I mean, it's ironic because earlier I was talking about how it's difficult for me to understand how reductionism is false. You know, isn't it obvious? But it's looking back over the course of philosophy in this very neat line, right, where it's laid out for me. And it's the same thing. That's what Quine's book I think has a tendency to do. Is that you see this knockdown of this thought, this notion of like progress, of like scientific progress being these singular achievements, one leading to the other. And in actuality, it's these frameworks, right? And I think that's
entire frameworks change.
Right. Yeah, and that they have to. It has to take a tipping point. Like it's got to move forward for a long time. You can't have that kind of. You can't have everything up in the air and singularly being worked on in a vacuum. It just doesn't work that way. So it's interesting.
Yeah,
it really
the
changes.
acceptance of. Sorry.
It really messes with your mind because I think we have this illusion that things are much cleaner than that. So, yeah. Oh, come on! I cut off like 2 people right there. There's nobody else. So I think, do we want to put a lid on this? And does anybody else have any other kind of closing thoughts? Or this was really content packed and really nice hangout. I'd hate to have it.
But when you say closing thoughts, are you just talking about with respect to this paper itself, or just with regards to the broader issues that it impacts? I think
we want to talk about the broader issues. We can certainly do that. If people want to talk about how they take this now.
I'm going to have to go in a bit. It's time to feed myself.
Why don't we go ahead and we can, in the after show, we can do an off air of talking about consequences of this.
Well, you can do another hangout with regards to what followed from this, from perhaps a paper that was in response to it, like in Defense of a Dogma by
Strawson and Grice.
Yeah. So in terms of next topic, I was actually thinking about In Defense of a Dogma, and then you had mentioned a couple of Quine's other works which led to this one, Hypatia, that I think would be interesting to explore as well. But I don't want to have everybody get burnt out on Quine. Originally, when we went into this, I think up until yesterday, when I actually thought about In Defense of a Dogma, I was thinking about having a hang in like probably about 4 or 5 weeks time on G.E. Moore's Proof of an External World and juxtaposed with Wittgenstein's Uncertainty and the response that he had in there.
Actually, things like that where there's two texts in opposition, we say you can discuss the tension between them. It's probably a good idea, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many other little texts that I want to hit. We'll maybe we can have a future hang on defense of a dogma, but kind of move into some other areas. So, cool. So why don't we? I'll put together a launch video for anybody who wants to participate, and anybody in the audience who's watching. Just message me if you're interested in that. I'll put together a launch video with. In the description will be some sources to kind of get people started, kind of a primer to kind of get us on the same page, and then take a look at when we take a look at G.E. Moore's Proof of an External World and Wittgenstein's Uncertainty, which is one of my favorite books. That would be nice. Does anybody else have any closing thoughts or? Cool. Well, thank you so much for. This was a pleasure. I learned a lot.
It was fun.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for spending your Saturday. Happy Father's Day, and enjoy the rest of your day.